Josh. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see so many happy faces this morning. The weather's turned cold, but the love of Jesus is burning warm in our hearts, and it's awesome. I was really enjoying to see and participate how the body is ministering to each other, and that's the way it's supposed to be, where we care. It says when one member suffers, we all suffer. When one member rejoices, we all rejoice together. So I've been seeing that this morning, and it's a blessing. So God bless you all for caring. So, for once, I think my message will be pretty short for a change. I've been telling the boys a Bible story. I tell them a story pretty much every night when I put them to bed. And so Skylar kept requesting the same story over and over every night. It became his favorite. And I'm thinking, because I always let them choose, and I'm thinking, come on, switch it up a little bit. But finally, as I kept telling that story over and over, all of a sudden, there were so many things in there that started encouraging me. It seemed like every time I tell the story, there'd be something else. It'd be like, oh, wow, that's for me, for right now, what I'm going through. And I started looking forward to telling the story. And so it's the story in Daniel chapter 3 about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. And so we're going to talk about that story. I felt like that's what God put in my heart to share this morning, just some of the things that have been encouraging me in it. And I think it's somewhere in Hebrews maybe where it says that these things happen for examples for us to learn from. And so, the stories in the Old Testament aren't just, for entertainment, like some awesome story that may or may not have happened long ago. It's actually recorded for us to be encouraged by and to learn from today. So, and as we go through the story, let's remember that this actually happened. Everything that we're going to read actually, truly, really happened the way that it's recorded. And it's really amazing. So in Daniel chapter 3, and I was going to see if someone wanted to bring their Bible and come up here and read that for us, read that chapter for us before we go into it. Who would want to volunteer for that? Who loves to read? Joseph. All right, come on. You got it? You want to read it in your Bible? Okay. Or how about my phone? I like this version. New Living Translation. All right. Nebuchadnezzar. All right.
Oh, wow.
You got this.
King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statues 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of
Dura.
in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officials and governors,
Advisors.
there you go, treasurers and judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the status he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue of King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar, gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue the king of Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue. When they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and other musical instruments, that decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down, worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of this musical instrument. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your God or worship the gold statue you have set up." Do I keep reading?
Yep.
Okay. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. And he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bend Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, his rage, his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men. The 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did." They replied, "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men abound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looked like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came and closed as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servant of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the higher officials, governors, advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their head was singed, and their clothes was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angels to rescue his servant who trusted in him. They defiled the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb and thrown, and their house will be turned into a heap of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon.
Amen. Woo, good job, Joseph. Good job. Thank you. God, thank you for the story and for the faithfulness of your 3 servants. And I pray that whatever way that you would like to encourage us this morning and strengthen us, that you would do that. Open our hearts and our understanding to hear from you and to be blessed. In Jesus' name. Any observations that any of you, while we were reading the story, that just kind of jumped out at you? Anything special? Yeah, John.
I always remember from the time I was a little boy when I read this, wouldn't it have been easy to just bow down and worship God?
The God. Yep. Yeah. It's using your brain, right? Yep. Anyone else have anything? An observation?
I think the problem, if there's a problem with that, John, is it's not that I am worshiping Nebuchadnezzar's idol or Nebuchadnezzar. It's important what other people are noticing. If they see me as a servant of the Most High God, it's important how is my actions being perceived. No correction on that. It's just a thought that I had when I heard you say that.
That's what I was looking for, by the way.
We knew you weren't saying that that's what you would do. So, did you notice that the statue, it says it was made of gold, and it says it was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. That's a pretty good hunk of gold right there. Could fund a lot of missions with that. Oh, I don't know where he got that much gold or where it is now, but come in handy. So in the story, the purpose of calling everyone together, or all the rulers and the magistrates, all the highest people in the kingdom, the purpose of it was, it says, a dedication or a ribbon cutting for this god. This was like after this god was made, the first time they're getting together to do the dedication to the god. And so he summoned all the high-ups in the kingdom to come for this, and that included these three Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were Jewish captives, okay? They weren't a part of this whole thing because they went there and, did their political moves to get into that position. They were actually Jewish captives, and they were taken to Babylon. And then the King Nebuchadnezzar had selected a few of the Jewish young men and trained them in the language and in the culture, and he tried to get them to eat, his food from his table, whatever he thought would make them smart, and so he put them in this position. So that's who they were, and they were summoned there with the rest of them. And, it's interesting and noteworthy, I believe, that they came, right? In my mind, I'm like, why did they even come? If they knew this was a dedication to a god of gold that was created by the wicked king Nebuchadnezzar, and the purpose of coming together was a dedication to that god, why didn't they just not come? I mean, maybe, the king wouldn't have noticed. But either way, it seems like sometimes we would think, well, don't even go there. But they went. They knew that for them to go there wasn't violating obedience to their God in heaven. So they went. They were summoned and they went there. And as we go on through the story, the signal to fall down and worship this God was music. So music isn't a bad thing, and it has all the instruments listed that were sounded together to signal them, and we're even told in Psalms to worship God with some of those same exact instruments, right? And so music is what the king chose to be the signal. So they used a good thing, music, to trigger what? A sinful action, an act of disobedience to God. And so, but it's so easy to justify an action based on the signal or the thing that triggers it is a good thing. And so there was nothing wrong with the music, right? That wasn't what the problem was, is they used music and then bowing down, that's what they're supposed to do next. Play music, bow down, right? And the bowing down, we're also called to bow down and worship, but it was what they were worshiping. And then John brought that up. Why didn't they just do what everybody else did? But in their hearts, they know, and they could even have made this agreement together amongst the three of them, like, we're going to bow down, but we're going to bow down to God. We're going to worship the true God. But they knew that, like Wiley said, there was no distinction. There would be no distinction that they're not bowing to this God, and everyone around them, that's what they believe, and that it would be an act of fear instead of faith. I believe that that was the thing, that they were going to stand believing God and not because of fear agree with what the enemy wanted them to do. And so for me, in my life, how I would apply that is how many times I'm faced with something that, and see, the king had, even when he told them, you have to do this, it was his command had a threat attached to it. You have to do this, and the threat was something really bad's going to happen to you if you don't. You're going to be thrown in the fiery furnace, and you're going to be burned up. And so how many times the enemy approaches me with something, he makes it look good, like if I do this, there's a threat attached to it, it's going to be really bad, but if I do this, then it's probably going to be a much better outcome for me. But the threat that's attached to it is what motivates me in fear to do what doesn't seem like such a bad thing. You can always find a way to reason that it's not a bad thing necessarily. But we have to be really, really, really careful with that, because the enemy still does it that way for us today, where he puts a threat in with it to make us compromise, and the choice we make is based on fear instead of on faith. And we choose to agree with him without even realizing it hardly. But I thought about, too, that the king, the way that he approached this of you have to do this, giving them a command that they have to obey, and then attaching a threat to it, I used to believe that that's how God is. I used to believe that God is commanding us to worship him and to obey him, and if you don't, I'm sending you to a fiery place. That's what I believe for years, is that that's the scenario, I want to obey God and I want to worship him, because if I don't, I'm going to be sent to this fiery place. And that is an absolute wrong mindset that the enemy wants us to live in, that does not produce good fruit. The truth of that is that ever since Adam fell in the garden and disobeyed God, then sin separated him from God. Disobedience and sin separated him and Eve from God. And that's been the story ever since, is that our sin separated us from God. And so we are serving the enemy when we disobey God and obey and agree with the enemy. And so God made this redemption plan through Jesus to redeem us back. So we're going there to the fiery place, except that God made a way to completely 100% reconcile us back. It's a completely different scenario, and it produces a completely different fruit and result and faith in our hearts. And so let's not let the enemy lie to us about what God has provided for us. We were going to the fiery place, but then he made a way for us to, if we'll receive it and take full advantage of it, as Wiley would say, then to actually come, not just escape the fiery place, but to come into a relationship that is like it was in the garden before that happened. So when he gave this signal, and everyone knew that that's their consequences if they don't obey. With Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they weren't going to bow down. And so someone went to the king and told them, these three men, they didn't bow down to you. They didn't obey your command. And so the king, he was very angry, it says, and he ordered them to be brought before him. And he told them, I'm going to give you one more chance. I'm going to give you another chance, because if you read the previous chapters, he actually really, really liked them. He liked Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were highly favored in his eyes. And even though he was very, very angry, he really didn't want to have to burn them up, right? He would have preferred that they would obey his command, so he was going to be nice enough to give them another chance in case, and he also made sure that they understand, okay? If you don't, this is what's going to happen to you. And you know what? They didn't even want another chance. They literally told him up front, they said, you can give us another chance, but we're not going to bow down to you. We're not going to. We're going to trust and obey the true God. And this made him, because of their faith, their staunch faith, and they're not even, he's extending another chance, like he's giving them a way out still, and they're not going to take it, made him even angrier. And it says that his countenance was changed. He was so angry, and he made the furnace 7 times hotter. He commanded it to be made 7 times hotter. And how many times, brothers and sisters, when we're faced with a trial, with something that's not easy, with somewhere in our lives, on our journeys, that we're choosing to make a choice that we know is right, but it's very, very difficult. And it looks like fear would want to grip us, but we stand in faith. That how many times when we do that, does it seem like the forces are mustered and the attack is just intensified like crazy? We're faithful. We choose to be faithful, but instead of now the attack, we're breaking through the attack, it's like it's more. It's just like more comes at us. I've had that happen, and this is exactly what was happening here with this king, is that because they were faithful, it made the enemy so angry, and he mustered his forces, and he turned the heat up 7 times hotter. So if you feel like the heat has been turned up in your life 7 times hotter when you stood and did the right thing, that does not mean that you did the wrong thing. Not at all. It's probably the enemy, last-ditch effort. I'm going to get him to turn still. So he said, make that fire 7 times hotter. And they told the king in verses 16 and 17, they told the king, we don't need to defend ourselves to you. Let's go there. He said, who is the God that will be able to rescue you from my power? And they say, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. We're going to trust God. Their posture was, if we're doing the right thing, if we are standing and trusting God and believing Him and choosing the right, we don't need to defend ourselves because God is going to defend us. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God who we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if He doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up. And they had such confidence that God would. They had the full confidence that He could, and they even believed that He would. But they said, even if He doesn't, He's still God. And I realized that by them saying that even if He doesn't, He is still God. They did not take the position that they did because they knew for sure that they weren't going to suffer. That's not why they were willing. The reason they were willing to stand and believe God and choose right is because they knew that if they would, they wouldn't have to suffer. They didn't know that. They knew God could deliver them, but they didn't know for sure. They said, even if He doesn't, then we're going to trust God and we're not going to bow down. And then as I was seeing their faith, and like right in the face of real fire, like not fiery trials, but real roaring fire that was now 7 times bigger and hotter. And I could just imagine the king, like, taking them up, like where they can feel this heat. That's where you're going if you don't bow down and worship, And just to see, like, the faith that they had to believe God and stand in that place of trusting, I thought about the fact that they could have so been victims in this situation, been like, well, why did God ever even allow us to come to this point? why did God allow us to be captured? We're here because God allowed us to be captured by the enemy. Why didn't he deliver us way back then? And now, because God didn't deliver us, I guarantee you they cried out to God when they were going through that captivity and all that happened there. They were crying out to God to save them and deliver them. But they're captives, right? They've been taken captive, and they could have said things like, we asked God. We believe that he would rescue us. We believe that he would not allow us to be captured, but he did it. And now we're faced with this. Like, we don't know if we can truly trust God, you know. All the whys that the enemy can throw into our minds to make us doubt and to compromise and to go back. And some of the things that I don't necessarily understand that I prayed about or prayed for that didn't go the way I thought they should or would, to not change what I know about God and who he is and what he wants from me right now, today, but to believe and trust him for that and not look back. But they were so confident that it was safe to trust God that they were very, very, very grounded in that. And so then in verse 23, so anyway, they tied them up and they threw them into the fire. I wanted to read in verse 23. It's a verse that's, it makes it sound pretty hopeless. It says, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell down into the roaring flames. So how many times have you felt just like your hands are tied in a situation? Anyone ever felt that way? Like felt that way, not what you knew here, but your hands are just tied in this situation. I don't know which way I can turn here. Either way, it doesn't look like a good option, right? And then, how many of you felt like you got knocked down in a situation? And how many of you have ever felt like you're in a very hot fire? I think we all have. Well, this was their literal scenario, all three at the same time. They were securely tied, and they fell down, securely tied, in a roaring fire. That is quite the scenario to that if ever we would feel hopeless in ourselves, it would be in a situation like this. But they were trusting God. And so, as they stayed faithful and trusted God, guess what happened? The very fire that was to be feared, or that none of us would want to go into, is what burned their ropes off. The thing that had them bound up, the fire burned their ropes off, right? Now, that represents freedom. They were freed. It was freedom. The ropes were burned off. And the king, all of a sudden, as the king is looking, he's looking in there, and he's expecting them to just, in no time, they're gone. They're burned up. But all of a sudden, what does the king see? He sees their ropes burned off. They stand up. They're standing. And now, instead of 3, there's 4. The king himself recognized something. He recognized that God was with them. The king himself saw God in the situation. He couldn't deny that God went through the fire with them. And so, as a result of that, so is the very fire that he built and he threw them into, and he saw God go through that with them. What better way to defeat the enemy than to just trust God and go through with it? And the very thing that he created to destroy them, he saw God. He couldn't deny it. And so as a result, God was glorified, and their faith was strengthened, and they were promoted to an even greater position where they were able to influence towards truth and what is right. If they would have bailed like way before that, like, for example, not even going when they were summoned to go there. We're not going to a place like that. Well, like, we know what that's about, to, consecrate this God, to this ribbon cutting of this God. Like, we don't want to be involved in anything like that. I believe they got direction from God, and I believe he gave them direction to go. But what if they would, because of fear, like, we don't want to be confronted with this thing, they would just not went and hope the king didn't notice that they were sick and didn't come. No, they didn't. If they would have bailed at that point, the outcome would have been very different. Even if the king would have overlooked it, that they weren't present, God would not have been glorified. As a result of this, the king sent out a decree that was completely opposite of commanding everyone to bow to his God, and it was to worship the true God. And he said, I know who the true God is. But if so many times I believe that I have tried to avoid a situation that I knew would be very difficult. And I detoured and found another way because I just knew it was going to be too hard. Like, I didn't want to go through that. Instead of, God, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to move forward and into that situation? And if God says yes, if God leads me there, to trust him with it. Because we don't know what the outcome, what God has planned. How many times do we bail on God and then whatever he has planned, because it says, all things work together for good to them that love God. And that's exactly what happened here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it definitely worked together for good. And if they would have, like we discussed earlier, just made a small, what seemed like a slight compromise, we're going to bow, but we're definitely not bowing to this God, and they all had this understanding amongst themselves, the outcome would have been very different, you know? And so just some encouragement for us with some of the things that we are going through here. What should our heart posture be? I believe that we should, first of all, not be afraid of the heat, the fire, the fiery trials, the things that want to make us draw back. Before we draw back and take a different route, that we ask God, what is your heart? And Johnny shared some of that this morning earlier when in testimony. Because even if it can look like a hopeless situation with a dead end, so many times, not just this story, but if you read the Old Testament, it was always seemed like very last minute when God showed up. And if we went by what we can see and what we feel, we would have stopped and turned back long before getting to that point. But then God wasn't glorified. Then God wasn't made big and glorified in his power and his faithfulness. So let's go with God wherever he leads us, not go by our feelings and not stop because we think we see a roadblock or a dead end up ahead or a hot fire roaring up ahead. So now we stop right here and turn around and take a detour. Let's not do that. If God is leading us somewhere, let's trust him and follow him even into the fire, because if he went through the fire with them, which he did, he'll go through the fire with us if we're trusting him. He will. And that is when the enemy is truly defeated. When the enemy sees that instead of choosing fear, we choose faith and to trust God, and we go right into the fire, and then he sees that God is going through it with us, the enemy is truly defeated. He's defeated when we choose to trust God instead of, because of fear, agree with him. And he will try everything he can to, in little ways, get us to agree with him. He'll try things that seem not too bad or like a decent option. Not the best option, but a definitely easier option and not a wicked option. So he tries to get us to agree with him in those ways. But if we do that, God's not up there with a big stick fixing to whack us or just let us burn up or something. But his purpose and his plan many times that he had in that is not fulfilled if we don't walk by faith, if we let fear deter us. So that's pretty much what I had to share this morning. And I have one other thing that I was asked to announce this morning, or talk about a little bit. And